St. John the Divine asked the angel, "Who are these robed in white?" In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. My moral and spiritual imagination were formed, I think, as a middle schooler reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit and C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. If you haven't read them to your children or given them to read, it is malpractice. You have to give them these beautiful works of fiction, which are so profoundly Christian in the texture of their spiritual life, the spiritual message that's given there. And one of the things that, in Tolkien's work, is basically, you have these very, you have this idea of this grand world stage where they're big political, you might think of them as large geopolitical movements, right? And in the midst of all this, there are the hobbits. Right, the humble hobbits of Middle-earth wondering about second breakfast and tea and all that, the things we thought, you'll meet them at tea, especially if you're a hobbit. You can meet them at second breakfast too. It's an inside joke for the Tolkien people. But in a sense, the hobbits, and in the movies they portray, it's like you have all these characters, these cloaks and bright swords and armor, and then the hobbits. There's this line where Lord Aragorn, he's looking for the hobbits, and he says they would appear as nothing more than children to you, right? They were humble. They had, kind of brown homespun clothing. And yet, of course, as you know from the story, if you've read it, the hobbits are the ones who, in the end, win the day, right? They're the ones who accomplish the great work of salvation for Middle-earth. They're the ones in their humility and in their faithfulness to one another and to their cause. They are the ones who are able to, in a sense, affect the victory of love, the victory of all that is good and beautiful in the world. And what I also love about Tolkien is that, in a sense, the hobbits get a change of clothes at the end. So for most of the story, they're in, again, that kind of homespun kind of wool. You might think of, kind of like, farmer clothing in Middle England, in the 1920s and 30s or something. But on the way back home, when the victory is won, they are clothed in the livery of the knights of Rohan and Gondor. In a sense, they get a change of clothes. And when they come back home to Hobbiton on these horses that they're given, they look fabulously strange, since their clothing has been transformed. What's happened is that in their faithfulness to that which is good and beautiful and full of light, in their faithfulness to their vocation, they've, in a sense, been recognized for what they always were. In a sense, the hobbits, at the end of the book, when they come riding into Hobbiton in their clothing of knighthood and royalty, are dressed like the people they've always been. Since it's the big reveal that all along, if you had the eyes to see, and that's part of Gandalf's magic, is he has the eyes to see the royal nature of the hobbits when everyone else in the world would overlook them, right? Oh, they're just hobbits. They're small. They're insignificant. What could they accomplish in the grand scheme of things? But Gandalf knew from the beginning that theirs was a royal character. And their vesting at the end of the book is in accordance with the character that was always there. Now, one of the jokes between, again, this is very nerdy, but one of the jokes about, comparing Tolkien's works with C.S. Lewis's works is that Tolkien goes through all this work of world building. He actually invents an entire Elvish language before he wrote any of his stories. And you compare that sort of world building and attention to detail with C.S. Lewis's having talking animals and Santa Claus come in the first book. I mean, it's of a different order. C.S. Lewis is just having fun. But in a sense, C.S. Lewis had the equivalent of the Hobbits for C.S. Lewis is actually quite the same arc with the same results. For C.S. Lewis, instead of the Hobbits, you have the Pevensey children. 4 normal children fleeing the Blitz in London, right? Seemingly unable to affect the course of great events, right? Fleeing for their lives into the English countryside. But then they enter into a place called Narnia, which in a sense is the world under God's grace, the world according to salvation history. And they enter into Narnia, and they go through all of the stuff in Narnia wearing their old clothes, right? Which gets dripping wet and which gets torn, and has all the adventures happen to them. But when they are commissioned by Aslan to their task of helping to save Narnia from the witch, aka sin and death, right? It is, it's a children's allegory. It's not supposed to be subtle. But when they are commissioned for their vocation, they receive royal tools, a sword, a horn to call for aid. Lucy, the smallest, gets the cordial of healing, which, again, in a more ancient idea of kingship, kings were always associated with miracles of healing. And so Lucy gets a cordial of healing to pour on the wounded. And then at the end, they are all dressed as kings and queens, not as London school children, but as kings and queens. And in a sense, once again, and of course Tolkien and Lewis were good friends, and they were all trying to present the Christian story in these complex, beautiful worlds of imagination. But once again, the character of the children all along has been revealed in their royal investiture, right? In receiving royal robes. What is revealed is that if one is faithful to the cause of love and beauty and goodness and light in the world, that one can win the final victory despite being small, despite seeming insignificant in the eyes of the world. That's the story. That's what both Tolkien and Lewis in their ways are trying to say, is that, in a sense, when we enter into a drama, the drama of Jesus' love for the world and his willingness to be faithful to that love to the point of death, and the victory of life over death and darkness. That's the story. And we are called, us normal, small people are called to be a part of that story. And when we become a part of it and are faithful to it, we are revealed. Our true character is revealed. And virtues, symbolized by the clothing, are given to us as a grace, as a gift of the one true King. Now, we did something a little bit different in this Sunday's leaflet. You might notice that where the sermon is, there's a little picture there of someone. Now, I always like to say that I often come up with my best material when I'm speaking to children, and that's the case this Sunday. So last summer, at summer camp and Camp All Saints, our theme for the week, the story that we did that week was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, and we kind of presented, the themes. We tried to kind of exegete the allegory of Lewis for the children, and at the end, and so they saw the transformation of Peter and Susan and Lucy and Edmund. They saw the transformation of these characters into kings and queens. So they were primed. And so I showed them this picture, and I said, "Who is this? What does he look like?" And it's like, "Oh, see, he's a king, or he's like a royal person. He's some, it's like, because look at how he's dressed, right? Look at how he's dressed." Clearly, some sort of royalty. And then I told them that the person in this picture was named James Freed. To me, he was Mr. Freed. He was my best friend's father in high school. The young man who was the best man at my wedding, and Mr. Freed was there to celebrate with us. And Mr. Freed basically helped raise me when he and his youngest son, Joe, shared the same brain through high school, basically. I probably stayed at the Freed house at least, one night a week, if not sometimes whole weekends, just staying over. Now, the Freeds were, a Catholic household, and it's like, this is about 40 years ago. But anyway, so there's a Catholic household. And so basically, to give you the story of the Freed family, Joe had 4 older siblings who were all 1 year apart. Boom, 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 boom. Then 9 years later, Joe came along. So he has ears here. I was friends with Joe. So what that meant is that, he had all these older siblings who were so cool. I mean, they were awesome. And at the Freed house, there was always a card game going because they all lived in San Diego. And there was always a pot of spaghetti or a roast or something that Mrs. Freed had going on a Sunday afternoon or for dinner. It was always something happening in the Freed house. It was always a place of joy and fellowship. So, of course, I loved being there all the time, as much as Joe would let me. And so I was raised in the house, and I got to know James Freed. Now, in the eyes of the world, Jim Freed wouldn't have been an extraordinary person. He was a mid-level data manager at Teledyne Ryan, which was a defense contractor that had a plant in San Diego. And he went into data management when they were using punch cards. For those of you who remember data back then, he was the guy who was like, he had punch cards, and then they had the tapes on the supercomputers that took up whole factory floors. And so he went through all of that change and was widely respected in his company, and they kept on trying to give him, he rose basically to the level where he could, be on his career path, and the company, Teledyne Ryan, kept on offering him promotions, but it would require him to move, and he always declined the promotions. He wound up training many young men who then became his boss, 5 years later, when they would take the move and then come back to be his boss. He trained many of them. Why did he decline the promotions? Because he was rooted, he felt he was rooted in a community where his kids had grown up. He was a scouter par excellence. He was a scoutmaster for St. Martin of Tours, Boy Scout troop. He was, every Sunday he went to Mass, at least several times during the week. He was one of the best friends of the Roman Catholic priest who was in charge of the St. Vincent de Paul Center, which is in the Catholic world. That was a place, basically kind of a homeless ministry in downtown San Diego. He would always have that priest to dinner at the homes or take him out to lunch. And he volunteered there all the time. This is even as he's working full time. He would volunteer there. He would drive on his lunch breaks from Teledyne Ryan and go and serve lunch on the streets of San Diego. He was somebody who gave himself constantly to the causes of the community through scouting or through all the voluntary organizations. I think he was a Kiwanis, all those organizations where people got together to try to create a world that was better than the world they found. Leave things better than you found it. That was the ethic, right? That was the ethic of Jim Freed and that generation, who helped build so much of what we value in our culture, including the churches. And, in addition to all that, as I mentioned about being at the Freed house all the time, Jim Freed basically helped raise, I don't know how many children in that neighborhood and in the school. All his children's friends. The Freed house was always a safe, joyful place to be. The door was always open. There was always another plate that could be put at the table. That was the way they lived. And for Jim Freed, that was more important than getting ahead, getting more money, being more important. And so in a sense, Jim lived and then died in a way that this world would find completely unremarkable. Right? He'd be one of the little people that would go through this life. But what an extraordinary impact. Now, so where did this picture come? Well, Jim, and of course I'm calling him Jim here, but because, even to his, when I went to his funeral, it was Mr. Freed. He was always Mr. Freed to me. But Mr. Freed was a part of an organization that's in the Catholic Church called the Knights of Columbus. And given the kind of person that James Freed was, he served all the time and was highly recognized. You can see kind of like, so there's some regalia. He's been given badges of recognition for all the ways in which he served the larger community and his own parish. I mean, do any of you know St. Martin of Tours in La Mesa, California? But Jim Freed helped make that place a place of grace, a place of witness in his giving his life to it. So much of his discretionary time and money was given to that parish. And so they painted, in a sense, the Knights of Columbus. You could commission, a portrait that with all your regalia, and you could have it as, this is you in your kind of parade dress, in your ceremonial outfit. And they had this portrait standing up at his funeral and next to the casket. And in a sense, what I found so powerful was the witness that, in a sense, in his investiture that looked so, in a sense, so royal in the portrait, it revealed the true person that Jim Freed had been all along, but only those with the eyes of faith could see. His priest friends saw it. His neighbors saw it. The scouts and his Boy Scout troops saw it. Those who knew him saw how remarkable he was. But in a sense, the world would think him unremarkable. Kind of middle class, mid-manager. And in a world, I think that in a culture like ours now, 40 years on, when, in a sense, celebrity and being an influencer is what makes you actually exist in our society. In a sense, how many followers do you have? I mean, that's pathetic. This idea that the number of people who follow you virtually is what determines your worth. It determines your ad revenue. And isn't that the same thing? I mean, your ability to make money, isn't that basically your worth? And in a culture that has gone so awry over the last 2 generations, we are well to remember on All Saints Sunday that we are capable of being vested with a beautiful grace, that we have a royal destiny. We have the capacity, when we are faithful to one another, when we give our lives to one another, when we decline the easy thing to take, when we are willing to set aside just the next job, the next appointment, when we're able to set those things aside and be faithful to one another and love one another, have mercy on one another, serve one another, that we reveal our royal character. And in a sense, when I saw that portrait of Jim Freed at the funeral, I thought to myself, that's how Jesus saw him all along. And that's how Jesus sees you and me all along. If we can live our lives in a way that is extraordinary in our capacity to love in small things, in small ways that make great differences to the people who receive that love. This is what it means to have the calling to be a saint, right? The calling to royalty, to a royal life. It's not about moral excellence. It's not, basically St. Peter didn't walk around with a halo when he was in Galilee. He's very impressive on stained glass, but I imagine he was not so impressive to those who saw him with the eyes of the world. We know in Acts chapter 4, it's like, aren't these guys like Galileans? I mean, it's like, aren't these guys like, fisher people? I mean, who are they to lecture us? I mean, you could see that they were nothing extraordinary in the eyes of the world. And neither are we, honestly. But it's a holy nevertheless. But we are vested in grace. That in Jesus' love and our capacity and willingness to share it, we are made beautiful. And that is how Jesus sees you right now, no matter how you feel. You may feel small, you may feel insignificant, you may feel shabbily dressed in terms of your life and how things are going. But be not afraid. Take courage, as the hobbits and the Pevensey children took courage and were faithful to their calling. You have a high, holy, and royal calling and destiny, which begins today.